Let me get straightened out before we begin. Okay, so I think we're on the air. This is Journeys in Podcasting, a lunchtime edition, and today we are very lucky to have two guests. One is Lola Barreto, who organized this talk, and the other is Peter von Stackelberg of the World Building Institute. Hi, Peter. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Okay, and so what we're going to try to do is connect a lot of the projects you've worked on to a lot of our education movements and projects, and to kind of think through how world building could be an incredible project development within schools and beyond school walls as well. One of the research articles we looked at was the Tales of Tomorrow, Transmedia Storytelling and Communicating About the Future. And you mentioned this study of foresight, which I believe you did at Clear Lake University just outside of Houston. And I wonder if you could give us just a little bit of background. What is foresight study, and how does it relate to other kind of futurist studies?
Yeah, in the early 1990s, I think 93 is when I graduated from the program, at the University of Houston, Clear Lake, which is one of the suburbs of Houston. The Futures program was or is designed to give you insights, give you methodologies, give you techniques as it relates to looking at the future. And when I say looking at the future, I mean in sort of the broadest sense. I specialized in technological change, why technology changed, how it changed, and what the impacts of that technological change were. And in going through the program, I learned a lot about different kinds of methods, and I think also probably just as importantly, picked up a habit of thinking broadly about a variety of topics, thinking about things using a systems approach, so that when you looked at how one thing causes another to happen, you're not necessarily just looking at A causes B, but A causes B, B causes C, C causes D, D causes A, and around you go in a cycle or a circle. And using that perspective is very helpful when it comes to understanding this world that we live in, and certainly the dynamics of the world as it changes and as we move into the future.
And so you write that this sometimes has a difficult marriage with science fiction, that the seriousness of future studies, science fiction can be a great assistance to it, but it can also build this kind of mistrust. I want to talk about this idea of appropriating narrative. You mentioned it as the oldest teaching method, and in your paper you say simply presenting data and having a rational discussion is not enough to move people to action, that the rapid evolution of digital media technology and the emergence of transmedia storytelling present foresight professionals with a powerful new approach for communicating about the future. Judging by what happened last week in the elections, where elitism was used to create a perceived divide in the population, how do you think transmedia storytelling can democratize this planning for action, particularly considering this participatory nature of transmedia projects?
I think, let's take a step back. Transmedia is only the sort of most recent iteration of different storytelling techniques. And it's the notion of using stories that I think is probably the most important piece. After that, then you can get into transmedia storytelling. But again, the operative word is storytelling. What happened with the elections in the United States was there was a story being told. by one candidate that was much more compelling than a story, or really hardly a story told by the other candidate. The story told by Donald Trump basically worked off the emotions of people. And I think if you engage people's emotion, you've engaged their attention. And what happens is that when you've got their emotions and you get their attention, they're much more able to basically deal with the data, whatever data it is that you're presenting. An example that I give is the let me mute here.
Sorry, we're getting some interference from Great Britain as James and Am is trying to connect to the podcast. I left a note here for him to mute his mic. Let's connect just a second, see if we can sort out his technical problem.
Yeah.
Just inconveniences.
Yeah. This is the beauty of Google Hangouts is that we all get to connect around the world at a moment's notice, and the difficulty is that every now and then we run into these glitches.
I'm going to mute my speakers here, or turn them way down so they're not as distracting, and then I'll turn them back up when I finish what I.
Okay, I think we're set. I went ahead and muted James. So please continue about the narrative, the creation of narrative by Donald Trump over the non-narrative, and then you were going into the capturing of emotion. And once you have people's emotions captured, then you're able to relay a much larger quantity of information. I think that's where you were going.
Yeah, there's a much more direct route to I think people's brains, if you will. When you've got their attention through the use of emotion. And they're much more susceptible to a story. Doesn't necessarily have to be an accurate or true story, but they're more susceptible to a story. One of the things that I've noticed among futurists is there has been a tendency to want to talk about the data, talk about the scenarios, talk about basic information, but it tends to be almost at a distance emotionally. And what happens is that tends to leave the audience cold. They just, they don't buy into it in nearly the same way as if you get into talking about the same topics from an emotional and storytelling perspective. If, for example, I were to say sea level rise of 2 feet is going to affect the New York City, people are going to say, "Oh, okay. So what? How's that affect me?" If you provide more data, provide maps and stuff like that, for example, you may get a bit more buy-in, but not necessarily. And I use the example of New York City. I also lived in Houston for about 20 years. And a couple years back, did a very brief, literally a 2-slide story of the coast of Texas being flooded by sea level rise. And I know those stories have been played out in the Houston Chronicle and the other newspapers down there, for example. That doesn't seem to have changed people's behavior one bit. Certainly doesn't seem to have changed their concern about climate change and so on. my premise is that if you get a series of realistic stories, they may be fictional, but they are based on, valid data. Then perhaps you can reach out and touch people who are otherwise going to ignore the topic that you're trying to talk with them about. So that's where my comments about data versus story come into play in the article that you're referring to. Now, when we're looking at situations as it relates to the future or even the current world, certainly having correct, accurate, comprehensive data is important. But that's only the first step of several. You need to organize the information. You need to organize basically the data and transform it into information. Then what you need to do is add a context. Where is this happening? Who's this affecting? How does this affect the average person's life in the suburbs of Houston or on Long Island? How does 2 feet of sea level rise affect them? And what are the emotional impacts? What are the family impacts? What are the human impacts that occur? And if you do this, I think you're much more likely to reach people than simply saying sea level is going to rise 2 feet. Now we need to do something. So,
sorry, I tend to mute my microphone just so there's no interference. I was trying to pull up that image, but I'm still having some network problems on this side. So in the context of what you were talking about, I'm actually from Galveston, Texas. And so, have lived in this kind of sandbar mentality where, every 10 to 15 years a hurricane comes and causes great havoc. In one of the most recent ones, Mary Thomas, a woman that we were, close to growing up, and she's on CNN explaining to the world that she ordered the entire island to evacuate, and they asked her if she evacuated. She said, "Of course not. BOI. We stay here." So this mentality of living in constant catastrophe, and then trying to reach the same people with narrative. It kind of leads into another question I have about this idea of sci-fi as narrative. You mentioned the works of H.G. Wells, of Isaac Asimov, of Ray Bradbury, and the world building could go on. The Dune series, for example, the Mars trilogy that came out a few years ago. These science fiction writers created not just their own visions of the future, but they inspired several generations of readers to create a world based, at least in part, on these visions. You write that science fiction books, graphic novels, films, television continue to shape popular views of the future, and that this proportionate influence of science fiction is a testament to the power of storytelling. 30 years ago, science fiction was consumed by a minority of, I would call it, enlightened geeks. Why do you think this has changed? And there's so much interest in this idea of future dystopias, pushing us toward a more participatory consumption, hopefully filling us with more agency to take action? Or do you think it's leading to more just escapism in the face of catastrophe on one side and maybe lack of catastrophe, that people gravitate towards these conflicting stories, perhaps because they don't have those kind of conflicts in their own lives? How do you see this evolution of sci-fi storytelling?
Well, I think the first thing to recognize is that science fiction stories are a reflection of the times during which they're created. So as we look at science fiction from the 1960s or 1970s, it's completely different in terms of tone from the sci-fi of the late 1940s and 1950s. 1950s sci-fi was, gee whiz, golly gosh, look at all this wonderful technology. Some of the more sophisticated writers would tend to look at some of the problems associated with that. But for the most part, it was, science fiction was based on a mindset that technology was marvelous, if not magical, and that it would ultimately change the world. By the 1960s, 1970s, we started to see the promise of technology sort of fading away. In the United States with the Vietnam War, things like 3 Mile Island, you know, pointing out the problems of things like both nuclear weapons and nuclear power plants. Into the 80s, we were starting to get into more of a dystopian thing. 1990s, 2000s. We've, I think, largely entered an age in which we're at best ambivalent about the technology. I think as we move forward, we're going to be increasingly threatened by the technology, and we're likely to see that reflected in the science fiction stories that start to emerge. The dystopian works that we saw over the last decade or so, I think, are a reflection of the end of the Cold War, but the realization that we still had all sorts of social issues that hadn't been dealt with. So as I said, you know, these stories are a reflection of the times in many cases. Some of the stuff that I'm working on, for example, is a reflection both of the times now, plus based on the work that I've done as a futurist, where I see things going over the next 20 to 30 years. My intent, quite deliberately, is to be able to say, hey, we need to be paying attention to these things. We need to pay attention to nanotechnology and its dangers. We need to pay attention to biotechnology and what that's going to mean. We need to pay attention to what's going to happen as information technology becomes deeper and deeper embedded in our society and replaces people in terms of work. You know, all of these things are issues that are starting to emerge you know, I think need to be addressed, but haven't at this point been addressed by our society generally in a meaningful way.
So looking at a movie like Minority Report, which seems to be a big changer in how, one, stories are designed, but also in the intent. What was really shocking to me was to learn that the script was the last part of the project to develop, and that it was set for a near future, that this wasn't, you know, the science fiction of the Jetsons where everything's going to be just amazing. This was, there are real problems coming just, you know, 5 to 10 to 20 years up the road that we should deal with. I thought this was a very interesting take on science fiction, but also on this whole idea of developing story. And you talk extensively about, you know, creating the structure, creating all of the timelines, creating all of the structural pieces behind the world. And one of the last things to develop is the characters. And I was a little shocked to read it, just because I'm thinking of like Isaac Asimov and Philip Dick, amazing world builders, incredible concepts, but their characters come out very much like an Aesop fable character or a Brothers Grimm character, where they're kind of flat. They don't have incredible dynamics to them. But then if we look at Frankenstein, for example, which I've heard referred to as like the first real science fiction, you know, Mary Shelley had to create incredible psychological depth in her characters. To bridge audience, why is it so important that this character be authentic and believable? And more interesting, why last? Like, why is the character one of the last things to develop of the world?
I'm not sure in every case that the character emerges last. And with my work, for example, it's more of a iterative process. I may have an idea for a character, but it's not fully sketched out. So I need to understand the world that this character exists within. And where you get the dynamic with the character is the internal schematics, if you will, of that character and how they relate to the external world. And that's where the interesting interplay occurs, is when you've got that back and forth between the character and the environment within which they exist. I know that there are a lot of writers that sort of grit their teeth when they take a look at the approach that I talk about, because they think it's a formula that requires them that they absolutely have to do this first. And my response to that is as a writer, you can start anywhere. You can start with that world. You can start with the character. You can start with a particular incident or event, and then you build out from there, so that by the time you finish the process, you've got a well-formed story world and a set of well-formed characters that exist within it. So as a writer, the best place to start writing is where you feel comfortable starting to write. Don't worry about the rest of it. Now, what you will have to do, or should do ideally, is elaborate on a lot of those things as you go forward. But starting out, start where you're comfortable.
While we're on this topic of character, I see a lot of kind of design thinking in this development of the archetype character, of the character that is not just an individual, but is also representing a group. And you write, using a character to mirror the beliefs, values, thoughts, emotions, and actions of a group makes it easier for the audience to understand that group. The use of personas in marketing, some types of foresight projects, and other business activities are examples of how individual characters can be used to represent the groups. This is, for me, kind of a giant topic, especially coming from my subjective reality of growing up in the States, where we sort of, in my opinion, have lost a healthy way to talk about differences, and the very slippery slope of, as you're creating characters, you don't want to create the unbelievable Mary Sue, the perfect, feminist character who's just perfect in every way, because it becomes unbelievable. Nor do you want to get into typecasting African Americans, Latinos, Muslims. Recently, watching Arrival a couple nights ago, I was pretty shocked to see that they evoked Sapphire and Worf as tools for entering differences among cultural subjectivity. To me, this is kind of a easy way to otherize the other culture or person as incoherent, and it sort of ignores this modern code switching that many of us live in, where we're moving back and forth between cultures. The old days of sci-fi hopefully are over, where the black character goes down to investigate the long, dark tunnel alone. In world building process, one of the most impressive insights for me was seeing how radically collaborative the environment is. And I was wondering, do you have any methods or ways of prototyping these characters, of crowdsourcing feedback, trying them out, to see how they work. In something like Minority Report, for example, how do those characters develop, and how are they practiced with before they actually become the real thing?
Yeah, I think typically when it comes to writing, you've got one or two writers who are creating those characters, and then you may get feedback. One of the things that I'm working on right now, the main character is a woman. I'm trying to write from a woman's perspective, which can be challenging. Now, I've grown up around strong women. I have a lot of strong women in my, circle of family and friends. So I'm sort of always watching, looking, observing to see, gestures, expressions, behaviors, and so on. One of the things that I've tended to do pretty much my entire life is to sit back and observe. First of all, see what I can pick up, see what I can learn, without trying to make any sort of judgment on it. And I find that I continue to do that as I create my, my characters. A writer, by necessity, has to create characters that they aren't necessarily familiar with. They aren't, they don't know them intimately, because if you've got a cast of 24 characters in a novel, major characters, it's pretty tough in even an entire lifetime to gain the experience that would give you 24 unique individuals. Be able to look at and have experienced what they've experienced. So there is an element of research to things, to watching, to listening, to just simply being the observer. There's an element of creativity and imagination that needs to be applied. If you can share your thoughts with other people as you're working as a writer, that's great. There are a small number of people that I know that I'll share things with as I'm trying to develop, a character, a storyline, an image or whatever, and take their input. But ultimately, as the writer, it's your responsibility to do the best possible job to create those characters. I think part of what you can do is, by having a rich story world, you can make the experiences, make the behaviors of your characters much richer, simply because they have to interact with that particular world that you've created. So that's another way in which you can start to make characters somewhat more real. And ultimately, you hope that you manage to do the job well enough that you're not going to offend people.
Speaking with Lola yesterday, she was describing a project that she's working on, collaborating with Canadian scriptwriters and producers, and the difficulty in changing context between this creative element of writing and then the distrust of the marketing world, I guess, is what we're getting closer to, is where, the people in Canada are focused on trying to find something that will grab attention, that will sell. They have kind of a list of things that, stories need to have. And yet the Colombian perspective was, no, we're trying to actually communicate something in a near future that is very much about real life, soldier rehabilitation here in Colombia. How do you trust, I know this came up in your writings in several places. How do you trust Hollywood? And Hollywood doesn't have to be LA, but it could be anywhere, to tell the story where the ethics of creation could be more monetary as opposed to trying to get your concept across. Where do you see this creative tension benefiting, and where do you see it as very disruptive in the creative process?
I think that tension between the writer and the marketing, I think does exist, and the experiences I've seen of friends who have had work that has gone into the mill for television or movies. Sometimes the product that comes out is unrecognizable, and I guess as a writer, I would suggest that you need to be prepared for some of those trade-offs. Perhaps what you do is you accept certain marketing demands and try and do the best you can with a given product, given a particular creation. Or you can go an independent route, do it yourself, which has its own problems, and have much more ability to control what that final product looks like. One of the things that I've found really nice with the development of ebooks and Amazon is that it gives the writer a tremendous amount of freedom. I can put a book together and not have to worry about anybody acting as a intermediary when it comes to publishing that book. I can go straight to Amazon and produce it, sell it. And in fact, last week, there was a friend of mine who had written a novel. She was trying to get it published. It had sat for a long time, and I just said, hey, let's just put it up on Amazon. Took us a couple of weeks to do that. Cost us the entire cost, not including her time and my time, was $115 to put it up. And it's up. She's sold about 50 copies in the last week. She's ecstatic. And quite frankly, I was surprised that 50 copies sold. But it's gratifying to see that. The book she put together may have found a mainstream publisher after a year or 2 or 3 years worth of work trying to get through that whole process, and then another year or so to actually be published. So something like, places like Amazon can make a huge difference when it comes to the creative process and freeing up the author when it comes to that. Now, you also pay quite literally a price in that you may not sell a whole lot of copies of something. So the question then is, what kind of trade-offs are you willing to make?
And you're talking about sort of an individual, writing product. Looking at something, going back to the Minority Report, and I kind of want to carry this into the Relau project if possible. When things get crazy collaborative and you're working between different parties and different places, you mentioned that having the world template, having the construction of the world there for everybody to collaborate off of. Any advice for managing these complex projects? Because carrying this into a school would be similar to carrying it, across the United States, and MIT's working on it, and Spielberg has his team working on it, California. And the logistics of having so many movable parts and keeping everybody on the same page, how does that work? I mean, I know you create a sandbox world and you come up with some basic rules for the world. And then once you get different parties working on it, any tips or clues for strategies for keeping everybody on the same page? Any tools? How did you all do that?
Well, I think just generally it comes down to having a shared vision, and particularly having a shared vision at the top. Something like the Minority Report. There was the vision was shared, all right. It was from Steven Spielberg saying this is what we want, and the production team basically filled in the pieces from there. But one individual in that case had the primary vision of what that final product was going to be like. You mentioned Rolau. I remember working on that project for a bit. What was interesting in that was the group sessions that we had, where we sat down with 8 to 10 people at a table, had certain elements of the story world that we were going to deal with, and we talked about those different elements from our own experience, from our own perspectives, so that we could bring together a diverse range of views, and then ultimately come to some sort of consensus on what we wanted to include in particular in our aspect of the world that we're looking at. And there were, I'm trying to remember now, probably 20 teams like that, doing various things, doing various elements of the different worlds. And the conversations themselves were quite useful for the sharing of ideas, understanding other people's perspectives. And it was actually I think those conversations that in the case of that Rolau project that were probably the most valuable. As you're building a story world, as you're talking about characters within the story world, if you've got a group of people who are respectful of each other, even though they've got a diverse range of views, if you've got a group of people that is sitting down and talking about things, you'll start to come to a consensus, an understanding of where it is that you might want this world to go, where you might want these characters to be, how you might want things to turn out. So there's really not any sort of magic solution to it. It's just simply dealing with people, working with people in a manner that's respectful, in a manner that values their opinions, and being able to ultimately build consensus. And that, I think, from the perspective of creating story worlds for the futures field, is probably one of the most beneficial pieces, probably more so than actually having that world itself.
Well, I want to try to share a screen with you really quickly and see if I can get to this. Just give me a moment. Sometimes I have my own technical glitches over here as well. But what I want to show is what one of these templates looks like that you sent me, where we, there we go. And I believe it is over here. There we go. Sorry. Okay, can you see, do you see this timeline here?
Yes.
Okay, so this, I believe, this reminds me of studying Soviet studies years ago, where there's so many different moving parts and there's so many players, and so the only way to study it for us was to put it on the wall and map everything out, and you know, have social changes, economic changes, religious changes, political changes, so we could see how all the interworking parts of all the different regions were working. This, of course, is much more complex, and I'm sure if we brought this into schools, we would find ways to simplify it. But what screamed at me when I saw this was interdisciplinary projects, where you could get multiple different disciplines looking at the same topic and co-creating. Where do you even begin something like this? Do you just start with the parts that you know? How does this come into formation?
Just a brief history. Back in 1993, when I was in the Futures program, I was working through one of my classes on quantitative research methods. And we were doing charts and graphs and various other things on topics that we got to choose. And I found myself doing multiple charts and then pasting them together on a large piece of paper. And as I sort of kept building it, one piece of, one element at a time, it got more and more fascinating. By '98, when this one was produced, I had gone to the use of graphic software, Illustrator in this case, and started to put this chart together. The whole perspective, or the whole idea behind this, was to get a perspective on a range of areas, a range of issues: environmental, social, technological, political, and so on. And to track things like the events, wars, for example, when they occurred, tracking economic events, and so on. And as well, starting to look at different cycles that people have talked about. So I would just chart cycles and see what popped out. What surprised me is, particularly in retrospect, is some of the things that I forecast for around this period of time, in which we would have a period of social turmoil. Based that essentially on historical patterns in the United States, and I would probably think it's safe to assume that we're encountering a little bit of turmoil in the American social and political system, and overall globally as well. Since I did this one, did a couple of other ones, and I dug more deeply into the question of the impact of technological change. And there seems to be a relationship between new technologies, what are called lead technologies or techno-economic paradigms. Basically, the information age is the most current technological era. Before that, we had the mass production era with technologies like production of the car and other types of mass production. in the what's emerging now, based on my analysis, is the molecular age, which consists of key technologies related to biotechnology, nanotechnology, and other molecular technologies. What all of these technological areas do is they seem to drive significant transitions in society, and as a result of those societal changes, political transformations as well. So something like this chart, I know it can sort of blow people away. It's just often they can, have difficulty absorbing it. What I found is that sometimes it's best just to put it up on a wall and look at it from a distance to see if there are overall patterns that you can identify. And that's why I put this together, is so that I could look at it to see if there are any patterns that crop up across these different areas.
No, this is absolutely, from an educator's perspective, provoking. When I look at sort of the closest we've come to this, just teaching in elementary school. Now we've mainly dealt with prehistoric cultures in this realm, where the kids have to sort of create the world of the Native Americans through artifacts, through as many different sources as we can gather. And then they start creating fantasy narratives within that world. This is what I find most impressive, is that it goes both ways, that you go, it looks like 2 times as far back as you go into the future to try to spot trends and understandings of, I guess, giant human movements. Does this only apply to the construction of world building for narratives? Because this to me looks like a much more serious endeavor, which could be used within school, quite easily, just to study where we are currently, our past, and what we don't often do, and that is make projections into the future. What other applications have you seen for world building?
Well, let me just address the origins of this. When I first created them, I had no notion that this might be applicable in any way to world building. And back in '94, the concept of world building was not something that I had dealt with at that time. This was designed as a tool for futurists to take a look at, and others who are interested in the future, for them to look at where we've come from and where we're going. And basically using it as a visual set of scenarios, as opposed to absolute hard fact. If you're using this in a school setting, I would suggest, literally starting from scratch with a large roll of paper on a wall, put the hash marks for years up, and then get, students putting different things in, using colored markers, using Post-it notes, all of that kind of stuff. So that they actually interactively build this timeline. Again, the action of building the timeline, I think, is of as much value as the finished product itself, because you can learn a tremendous amount simply by figuring out where things need to occur, what sequence have they occurred in, and so on. And then, leave the thing up on the wall and let people study it. Let them play with it for an entire semester. See what pops out by the time they've finished with it. Now, from a world building perspective, I actually adapted the timeline approach to create timelines for story worlds. And one of them, for example, I worked with Lola to put together something for the Voltas project. It was not a comprehensive one. It was a bit of it was more of a draft, but it involved identifying the key characters, key events in their lives, changes that might occur in the city where they lived, in the country where they lived, changes in the environment, government changes, that kind of stuff. And basically anything that might be relevant to the story world. And then what I did is, with the example that you've got, I was able to identify a number of potential stories that came out of that particular story world.
Yeah, when she was trying to explain to me the evolution of the project, where they had developed Volta, these characters who are descendants of Lola, help me out there. I'm missing my historical. Alessandro Volta, from Italy. And so what I think you did was take some of her work and try to put this world building structure to it. So then this is the sandbox where then they could pick different moments in time, different characters, and start telling different stories, just as like a Star Wars has, or a Star Trek, where they start moving back and forth between different generations, different stories start spinning out of there. And within a school setting, I think you can see the crowdsourced potentials of this, where different students or groups of students could take different periods or different characters and start spinning out their narratives. So it could truly become a very collaborative process. It's kind of a thing of beauty, to be honest, because we talk about making learning and making thinking visible a lot. That's a very common trend, and the timeline has always been there. Many of us have used it in our own university studies. But taking something as comprehensive of this, you could easily connect global ed projects within school. I see tons of potential there. And I'm just thinking of one particular project that we tried last year of the Indigenous Studies, where the students' inquiry drove the whole thing. We just began with artifacts, and then from their inquiry with the artifacts, the questions made into affinity groups actually created the categories of economic, social changes, technology, so that the student inquiry actually drove the creation of the rubric for the world, so to speak. Now, any suggestion on tools? We've created Gantt charts for more complex projects. It looks like you said you're using Illustrator here. Have you seen anything out there that we could possibly use collaboratively, where I think the physical part on the wall is extremely important, but if there is asynchronous work to be done, if you're dealing with students in different times and places, any suggestions for tool work there?
Unfortunately, I have not found a tool that'll let me do this kind of stuff. I would love to actually be able to build one of them, but the coding is a little beyond my current capabilities. I have basically laid out a design for this, and the intent was, in fact, to have it interactive. And the reason for the interactivity is because of the value of that interaction, even if it's asynchronous. These work well as multi-person projects. But as I say, no, I really don't know of anybody that's got a tool like this at this point. Be happy to work with somebody, though, if there's anybody out there that
as we would as well. I'd like to touch on one more thing. I want to go back to these two slides here that I showed these to my family in Galveston, and their first reaction was, oh God, please let it be a movie or a book. Even my brother, who for his own enjoyment writes his own science fiction stories, and he travels with a dog and they share sensories. So when you create something like this, now this was just an idea of a hotspot. I want to kind of go back to this idea of the Relau project. Places like New Orleans, Galveston, Texas, and in Colombia, when you go to the Rosario Islands, I don't know if you've seen these aerial views, but you see these islands that you can't see any island. All you see is the tops of houses, because every generation the population continues to grow and the resources get smaller and smaller. These are kind of these hotspots that really leverage us thinking about future change, because they're going through it right now, and what will happen over the next 20 years will be even more telling. My brother's beach house in Bermuda Beach in Galveston was third row from the coastline, and now he's front row from the coastline, which has its certain advantages. But they also know that probably pretty soon the next hurricane will come and the sand line will move. It's a sandbar, so it's constantly changing, and they will have to relocate somewhere else. Do you see these as great points to create these dystopias or these utopias? Do you pick real locations in the world, or do you think it's better to kind of create Relau type projects, which are fusions of different areas around the world?
With the project that I'm working on right now, I'm picking real places because part of the intent is to be able to say the year is 2035. This is what's happening. And I want you to recognize the street that you're walking down, even if it's flooded, because that has the impact. And as you said, your family said, their reaction sounds like it was pretty strong. It got their attention in what, 2 slides? So, part of what I'm looking at is, let's take today's world and extrapolate it out, say 20 to 25 years, make some assumptions around climate change, technology, and so on, and let's see how our characters live. And I've deliberately chosen 20 to 25 years because a good number of the people who are making decisions now will either be around then, or will certainly have children and grandchildren who are around then. People who are just being born now will be in early adulthood and will be having to deal with this kind of stuff. So the idea is to make them think, because they recognize something that's familiar. You recognize, for example, if you've been to Galveston, you recognize the cemetery, the crypts, and where that is. And then by putting this kind of a story around it, it adds additional meaning to it that it wouldn't have if you were to set the story in some mythical place.
Well, I can say that delving into your readings has kind of, I was mentioning before we got on recording that I felt like I'd fallen down a rabbit hole. Haven't been this confused since we interviewed Henry Jenkins, and he just kind of turned our world upside down with all the projects that are currently going on, all the work that's already been done, and then the potentials of what this could do to our learning environments, and also just kind of to our participatory consumption of materials. I sort of foresee, we were talking yesterday about how we're moving towards this more participatory consumption of our fiction, for example, that it's no longer just reading a story, but it's communicating with other people and creating off of that story, and the potentials for that within schools. I think right now we're caught in this uncomfortable period where they're kind of like you're talking about, the creators of the novels and the producers of the films, for example. It creates this tension. Well, I think schools are caught in that same thing where things like gamification, and I'm not talking about winning points in class, but gamifying your environment, of using fantasy narrative within a field of study are still very kind of new and threatening to many. And yet there's some amazing work being done within schools. Paul Darvasi, who I mentioned in a lot of podcasts, he does augmented reality within his classroom, where he just plays with the entire environment as they study literature, you know, with his seniors. So the potentials are there. I feel like it's just a matter of getting your teachers together and jumping into it. Have you, well, let me ask you this first, because I know that we're far extending our requested time with you. Could you point us to any, I mean, from the World Building Institute, there is a mountain of link and resource to capture there. We've only mentioned a couple of the articles that most of the questions we were asking are really just from 2 readings, although from our Google Doc, if anyone's interested in exploring more, there's a dozen links there. But we were mainly dealing with What's in a World, Story World, Science Fiction and Future Studies, and Tales of Our Tomorrows, Transmedia Storytelling and Communicating About the Future. Peter, do you have any other recommendations of what you would, projects you see that are currently in motion that people should take a look at, or past work that you think would be inspiring?
Yeah, I'm terrible when it comes to the names of either individuals or projects, but I think a couple of the things that the World Building Institute has done, it's the project before Relau, I think, was Leviathan, which used some really neat technology. Part of the challenge is you don't see a lot of stuff about world building per se. Typically what you'll do is you'll see the end product that comes out of it, the movie, the book, the whatever, and not the process that goes into it. I'm really drawing a blank on that, so.
Let me jump in, because having recently just surfed through a mountain of this information, I can say that within your articles, there's quite a few links there, projects to check out just to get to know what transmedia media projects are about. The Relau project, I'm still delving into. It's a pretty massive project, so I've only gone through certain modules. And then the World Building Institute itself has a ton of link of past projects, of talks that are going on now. And I know that within the project-based learning world and the global ed world, there are a lot of these types of projects going on. Not as many transmedia, not as many crowdsourced, you know, creative projects as I would like to see. I think those are coming in the future. And of course, you're talking to people who are thinking very seriously about this stuff, especially using 360 media, using 360 imagery, 360 video. We've been very attracted to the collaborative aspect of this, and we didn't even get to a couple of the things I had listed on my questions, but one is this idea of it's not so much this media that you all are creating, it's the human interaction that it's creating among us. And so what we design is 360 media projects, but what happens within the room. So it's not just putting on cool goggles and looking at cool media, but then how do those people interact, and what are they going to create with that experience, you know, just afterwards. So we're working on these things as well. And if that Galveston narrative is going to develop into anything else, I can tell you there's a mountain of consumers behind me ready to delve into that as well.
I do have a short story somewhere that I'm going to be reviving at some point, but so I'll let you know. Great.
Well, I sincerely hope that our paths cross again. I know that you've collaborated with Lola before on the Volta project. And if we have something coming up over the next year, we would love to pass it by your eyes to get feedback as well.
Be happy to talk with you anytime.
Great.
Right.
I'm going to disconnect here. Stay on just for a minute. I'll end the recording now, and then we'll still be online here.
Okay.
Perfect.